Overcoming by Pure Voice Girl. Chapter 41. Hartford House was quiet as it settled down for the night, though staff still hurried about below stairs getting things set to rights after dinner. With their guests packed off back to Fernhill, and grandfather retiring to his suite, it seemed a pall had fallen over the evening. Their happy homecoming had been pressed with the potential for tragedy, and Will found himself restless as he mounted the stairs, his thoughts returning time and again to Alana, and how frightened she must surely feel. Winston whined uneasily at his side, anxious. Peter had returned into the house freshly brushed and smelling strongly of mint, and Will was grateful for his company as he let himself into his suite, his presence keeping Will's dread somewhat at bay. He undressed in silence, in his massive dressing-room, the echoes of his movements a hollow sound that brought his spirits low. He put his cuff-links in the pocket-watch away, smiling as he ran his fingers over the filigreed watch-cover. Jimmy had procured a proper box for him, and the sight of all those watches Hannibal had purchased lightened his heart somewhat. He would even now be on the train to the capital, Will imagined. No doubt he had paced and frothed at the station, anxious to be on his way, exhausted to find himself returning so soon. Will very deliberately did not touch the bond, though he was tempted. He couldn't bring himself to, not yet, and not now. The abrupt haste of their parting under such dismal circumstances had knocked him off balance, a light flick from fate's fingers reminding him of days past when he believed that his happiness would always be momentary, would always be punished. "Not any more," he murmured, fighting the loneliness that threatened. He missed Hannibal. He missed him with a strength that frightened him. It was only a fraction of what he might feel had they bonded properly, he knew, but even that fraction was quite enough. He quickly pulled his nightshirt on and covered it with his dressing-gown, giving himself a mental shake. Hannibal would return as quickly as possible, and was no more settled in this separation than he was. All would be well, and this strange sense of bleakness would fade beneath his husband's teasing smiles and dancing golden eyes when he returned to take his place. Winston yipped a split second before a soft knock came at the door. Will, still tying his dressing-gown sash, emerged to say, "Yes?"
"It's me, dearest. Are you decent?"
Mina called, easing the door open. She was in her nightclothes, hair in a heavy braid over her shoulder, and a single taper in her dainty hand. "You should have a lamp, Mina," Will scolded, closing his dressing-room door behind him. "Hartford House tends to be very draughty."
"It was too much bother," she said, placing the candle down on his vanity and blowing out the flame.
She straightened, smoothing a lock of hair out of her face, her expression pensive and troubled. "Is something on your mind?" Will inquired, abandoning his plans to read quietly before making an early night of it.
"The emergency Hannibal left to attend," she said, drawing closer, hands clasped tightly before her. "Has it something to do with his mistress?"
Will frowned, his stare steady and unhappy. He picked up his book, a pang striking him when he heard the echo of Hannibal's voice saying, "That is an instruction for monkhood." "Why would you ask me such a thing, Mina?" Will asked, seating himself in his little armchair and fussing with the soft edge of his dressing-gown. "More to the point, why do you expect I would tell you?"
"Because I'm your sister and I love you, Will,"
Mina said, dropping into the chair opposite, pitched forward like a bird poised to take flight. The voluminous folds of her nightgown and wrapper frothed around her, shrouding her slender body in layers of cascading fabric.
"I overheard Mr. Marlowe speaking to Lord du Maurier about it. It was nothing but supposition, but he seemed convinced that Hannibal had flown off to be at her side as she brings his child into this world."
Will shifted, avoiding her searching eyes. They had spoken too freely in parting, perhaps too loudly for interested ears, and Thomas Marlowe was no stranger to Alana Bloom.
"He was telling Anthony he would have to return to the capital to support her," she went on, fingers rubbing a nervous rhythm on the chair's arm. "He is her friend, you know. Why, I imagine he might possibly be more upset as he was. But it would be somewhat amusing, dearest, wouldn't it, if Hannibal's mistress disported herself with—"
"Mina, that is quite enough," Will said, and even though his voice was soft, the sharpness of his words and the look he leveled at her was enough to silence her. "Not only is this subject that is entirely off-limits to any fanciful imaginings, I will not allow you to speak so disrespectfully of someone whose situation and life you know nothing about." Mina drew back as if Will had slapped her, a pretty blush rising on her cheeks. Indignant, she said,
"Well, I had no idea you'd such a fondness for your husband's lovers, Will. Perhaps once the baby is born they might move here to Hartford. The three of you share a bed. I'm sure it would be quite cozy."
"Mina!" Will said, astonished she would suggest such a thing. "Hannibal's relationships and associations are none of your concern, nor is how we conduct our private lives. If I wanted to bring every lover the world has ever imagined for him into this house and into our bed, I would do so, and it would still be no one's business but ours." She stared at him, blue eyes wide and furious, her nostrils flaring with the force of her breath. "Hannibal is a doctor," Will said, almost angry himself. "He has been called to assist a patient in the time of need. Whatever Mr. Marlowe believes is irrelevant."
"Not to anyone else. Not that it would be much of a surprise to society that he's back to his old habits. I'm sure soon enough he'll be ripe as a peach with his baby. If there's one thing the world can count on, it's a man staying true to his vices."
"Hannibal isn't like that, Mina. Even if I was big as a house with his child, he would never turn the least of his attentions elsewhere." She cocked her head, assessing him as if he was a curiosity on display.
"Do you truly think so?"
she purred, smile small and tight.
"Will, you may have been married longer than I, but of the two of us I know more of men and their frailties. I am telling you, Will, once they get what they want, they discard you."
The chill in her words frightened him almost as much as the bitter unhappiness so clear on her face. "Hannibal's every action and word reaffirms to me that his attachment is neither trivial nor fleeting," Will assured her. Wistful affection tinged his voice when he added, "He loves me, Mina."
"Darling, when they're as deep as they can get in the only place they ever want to be, they always love you."
Mina sighed, shaking her head.
"Inconvenience them in the slightest? They'll forget they ever said such a thing. They are monsters, Will, programmed to gorge themselves on whatever they desire, and they will say anything, do anything, to that end."
She sat back in her chair, shoulders straight, staring at him from beneath her lashes.
"I wonder what he wanted from you. I mean, 6 years missing."
Will's eyes narrowed, heart picking up its pace.
"And suddenly he returns so entirely agreeable,"
Mina breathed, her words uncoiling from full lips, a serpent with ill intent seeking the warm flesh of Will's hope to sour like a venomous strike.
"Surely it wasn't just fear of his Grace's health. He should have been beaten from the grounds for the way he treated you, yet you merely opened your arms to him at the first opportunity."
Will wet his lower lip with the tip of his tongue, struggling to contain his anger and indignation at what she dared say to him. "That isn't true, Mina," he told her, certainty firming his words. "And that isn't what Hannibal wants."
"Darling, it's what they all want. And Hannibal wants that child, Will. His heir, his little boy. What better way to ensure he gets him than to breed you during your most fertile time?"
"Mina!" Will said, her name a crack of irritation. He was aghast that she would use his prior confidences to try to wound him, but not entirely surprised. "You will not speak so of the man in whose house you have been living quite happily."
"It is your house, Will, which raises a good point. When his Grace put control of Hartford in your hands, it was limited, was it not?"
she asked, all innocence.
"Bear Hannibal an alpha son, and Hartford returns to his keeping. I would say it's quite an incentive for a man like Hannibal Lecter, Will. It's no wonder he's been so accommodating and so ready to abandon you for the woman he prefers. He must surely think you've kindled already, and he can return to the life he truly enjoys while you nurture his heir. At least, Mr. Marlowe seems to think so."
Will flinched, fingers clenching on his book. "That wasn't what Hannibal was after, Mina. And yes, I am well aware of the terms by which Hartford House was given to me when I first arrived. I never expected I would keep control of it, Mina. This house belongs to the Lecters, and I always intended to return it to them should my marriage fail."
"Apparently he couldn't wait that long."
"There is every possibility that I would not provide him with an heir, but daughters or even Omegas," Will said sharply, irritation rising. "That was the very reason he fled Hartford in the first place, as there was no guarantee our coming together would give him the alpha son grandfather required." He trembled, frustrated with her, and seething, outraged on Hannibal's behalf as well as his own. His words were little better than a soft snarl when he flared. I may not be able to give him a child at all." Mina's eyes narrowed, searching him for signs of dissembling. "Hannibal accepts that," Will said, swallowing hard as he got his temper under control. All of his husband's reassurances flashed through his memory at once, drawing his anger from him. "Even should I never give him a single child, Mina, it will not change his affection or attachment to me." Mina blinked, a slow, studied movement that conveyed nothing but disdain.
"So he says. Yet still he tries, dearest, doesn't he? But I'm sure you're right, Will. After all, you surely know him better than Thomas Marlowe, who's been his friend for 6 years while you've sequestered yourself here in bitter solitude."
Will's mouth thinned to a grim, irritated line, bowing down with unhappiness.
"I imagine that even if Thomas rattles that loose tongue of his to everyone in his acquaintance," she said, picking a thread on her dressing gown, "then no one will pay him the least bit of attention. We all know that men like Thomas care very little for the truth, though I get the impression he has no affection for you, Will, and rather a lot for Miss Bloom. I trust your confidence in Hannibal's fickle fidelity will silence any gossip that Mr. Marlowe might start."
She slid to her feet and came to him, stroking her fingers through his curls. As children, the touch had always soothed him, a small and tender affection so rare his whole heart had hoarded it. Now it just left him cold as the look on her face when she gazed down at him, cat-wrapped and intense.
"He will return soon, Will, compelled by his great love for you. Surely he wouldn't stay in the capital, undoubtedly with his mistress and newborn child, while there is a celebration here at Hartford in honor of you. That would be terribly cruel, wouldn't it? And we both know Hannibal is never cruel, dearest, don't we?"
She retrieved her taper, bending to light it from one of the lamps Jimmy had left lit for him. With a small, pleased smile, she said,
"Good night, darling. I hope you only have the sweetest of dreams."
Will stared at the door for a long time after she closed it, behind her, flustered and angry and deeply wounded by her words, by the doubt she tried to instill, and by the doubt she knew still plagued him. Whether it came from a place of love as she claimed, or a place of malice as it seemed, she had accomplished her purpose. If Hannibal had not returned to Hartford House by the time their guests arrived, there would be ample fodder for the gossips to carry home to their parlors, and their relationship would once more be the subject of cruel speculation. Winston got to his feet, whining softly at Will as he grew more agitated. His tail gave a small wag that was both tentative and hopeful when Will looked down at him. "Well, she rather put a damper on my evening, I can tell you that. But we've no time for her nonsense, do we? Come along, Winston. I'd best collect that pistol Hannibal left me, or he'll be beside himself with frustration when he returns." Will got up, book under his arm, and put out the lamps in silence. Despite his insistence, his mind turned Mina's words over and over like a puzzle box, searching for seams to unravel it, and finding none, the purpose of her visit still a confounding mystery. Taking up the single lamp left, he let himself in through the washroom to Hannibal's suite, chuckling when Winston hurtled past him in eager anticipation of finding Hannibal there. "I'm sorry, Winston," Will said, passing the huge tub with a fond smile as he followed the dog into Hannibal's room. "He's not here." It left a cold lump in the pit of his stomach to say it, to walk into a room still heavy with his alpha fragrance when the man himself was so far away. The room lay shrouded with shadows and swallowed in darkness that might have been oppressive were it not for his mate's comforting scent. The enormous bed Will had hoped to share with him lay empty, the curtains drawn back in preparation, undisturbed by Hannibal's hasty departure. A departure society would see as his abandonment of Will yet again, should Thomas Marlowe have any say in things. Will's chin tipped up, pride in his own stubborn nature refusing to bend to the least of it. For everything he had lived through, and everything still before him, cruel words whispered behind his back were the least of his worries. Parlor gossip couldn't hold a candle to being pushed down the stairs, after all. The key to the lockbox was just where Hannibal had left it, nestled in the silver tray where he usually discarded his cufflinks. Will fished it out and unlocked the small box to find a compact but fully loaded pistol in a velveteen cradle. There was a folded note between the weapon and the hollow that held it, and Will opened it by lamplight.
"For when you have run out of trout, my love, Hannibal."
Will grinned, a soft husky rasp of laughter escaping him that brought Winston's ears to perk. It faded quickly, however, sinking beneath the weight of anxiety that had dogged his footsteps all evening. He put his book down to run his fingers over the brushes on Hannibal's vanity, over the bottle of very light aftershave he preferred, over the boxes generation after generation of Lector men had used to hold their small vanities of cufflinks and watch fobs and chains. He'd never come in this room even once in all the years he'd spent in Hartford House. He'd never tried the door, never passed the threshold, only instructed a weekly airing and change of bedding in case Hannibal should return unannounced. Yet in this very room, in the empty bed before him, Hannibal had soothed his wounds, had touched his scars, had spoken of his personal pains, and begun the process of healing them both that had led them to sharing the most intimate and vulnerable moment Will would ever share in his life.
And Hannibal wants that child, Will. His heir, his little boy. What better way to ensure he gets him than to breed you during your most fertile time?
Some small, mean part of his secret heart was furious at Mina for trying to sully that time for him, for trying to twist his memories of the heat they'd spent together into a sordid lie driven by intrigue. It was the same small, mean part of him that still doubted himself, and he resented Mina for hitting so effortlessly on it. She knew better than anyone how Hannibal's departure felt beneath the surface of understanding and logic and the reassurance of his bond. She saw it as the world would see it, how anyone would care to see it when the truth was something none of them could confess to. Will drew a deep, unsteady breath heavy with Hannibal's scent and closed the box, leaving it unlocked in case he had need of it. Winston sniffed around the darkened room, investigating every corner as if he might somehow reveal his master hiding there. Eventually he gave up, jumped up on the bed, and curled into a dejected ball with a despondent sigh. "Winston," Will said, placing his little lamp on the nightstand and moving to sit next to him. He stroked the dog's soft head and fuzzy ears, smiling when Winston rolled his brown eyes up, the very picture of misery. "You miss him too, don't you?" Winston whined, his tail thumping gently against the bed, delighted by any attention Will would pay him. Will sighed and looked around, dreading a return to his cold bed. This would be his first night alone since before his heat. He had grown used to the warm strength of his husband curled around him, and he was reluctant to leave the small comfort he found being surrounded with Hannibal's presence. But then, there was no reason he had to leave at all, was there? "What do you think, boy?" Will murmured, rubbing Winston beneath his chin. "He will have to become accustomed to the scent of dog eventually, won't he? Where better to start than where he sleeps?" Where they would soon sleep together, he hoped. He shed his dressing gown, draping it neatly over the back of Hannibal's favorite fireside chair, and folded the covers back. Even without Hannibal having slept there, his alpha scent clung to everything, cradling Will's senses in the same way Hannibal's strong arms always cradled his body. He blew out the small lamp and snuggled down into the bed, pulling the layers of sheets and downy blankets up to counter the ever-present chill in the air. After a few moments, Winston edged his way up and curled up against Will's back, heaving a grunting sigh of contentment. Will closed his eyes, finally reaching for the bond as he lay floating in Hannibal's earthy alpha scent. He found worry, impatience, fatigue, and hope that flowed into him without reserve. And beneath it was the distant, rhythmic whisper of his name, echoing like a heartbeat to soothe him to sleep. Mr. Black was a refreshing ocean of calm in an otherwise chaotic situation when Hannibal arrived, red-eyed, tired, and uncomfortable from a train ride that had taken far too long under such circumstances. "The midwife has come, my lord," he said, relieving Hannibal of his coat, hat, and gloves in the doorway. "Miss Bloom is progressing rather slowly by her report. I put them in the Daisy room." "Thank you, Black," Hannibal said, shrugging off his jacket as well in preparation for the work ahead. A ragged, half-snarled howl sounded above him, pausing him only momentarily. "Did Marissa accompany them?" "She did. She's up in the maids' quarters with her nurse, my lord," Mr. Black said, tending to Hannibal's things with care. "I will send Mr. Berger up with your medical bag, and I have footmen at the ready should you need anything from your office." "Thank you, Black," Hannibal said again, and bounded up the stairs 2 at a time toward the increasing ruckus. "Your ladyship, if you could just—" "I am not a ladyship. I am a miss. I am a miss!" Alana cried, sounding frayed and frustrated and frightened. Hannibal spied Margot lingering at the doorway, giving instructions to a rather nervous maid. She sent her off and offered Hannibal a wan, worried smile, holding her hands out to him, which he clasped briefly in his with a warm squeeze. "Thank gods you're here," she said, flinching when Alana uttered a pained, unhappy sob.
"I came as quickly as I could,"
Hannibal said, rolling back his sleeves and skating a glance into the daisy room.
"Thank gods for the train, Margot, else your message would not have reached me in time."
"I shouldn't have written for you. I was just so worried," Margot whispered, trembling. "She's early."
"What on earth are you doing in the capital?"
Hannibal asked, waiting for another breathless cry to end. "Mr. Flynn from the school had arranged a time for us to walk the grounds with the surveyors. It was all very last minute," Margot said, casting another worried glance inside. "Alana insisted she come. We had a squad of men escort us, and we intended to return home this evening, but all that walking was too much for her. Gods, we were so worried Mason might show up that we never considered something like this."
"Margot, you—"
"Lord Clarges!" Alana called, hearing his voice in the hallway. "Margot, I told you not to send for him. Both of you come here."
"You first,"
Hannibal whispered, scowling when Margot shook her head and pushed him ahead of her.
"Miss Bloom,"
he said, taking note of the harried midwife, who looked particularly displeased by his arrival. Alana stood at the foot of the bed, clinging to the bedpost, one hand at the small of her back and her face red with effort.
"You look perfectly beautiful."
She glared at him, mouth set with impatience.
"Pregnancy has always agreed with you,"
he said, offering his most charming smile. "Labor, however, doesn't," she called, swaying when another pain hit her. "Oh, he would never say that," Margot soothed, moving to draw Alana's loose hair back from her face. "Only think it," Alana said, slitting her eyes open to glower in his direction.
"You shouldn't be here." "I think I'm the one who should be saying that,"
Hannibal pointed out.
"What on earth were you doing out with surveyors so near your time?"
"They didn't have any other available dates, and I am not near my time," she flared, transferring her hand from her back to her belly. "I wasn't planning for confinement for another month at least." Fear filled her eyes, then, the driving force behind her short temper. It's going to be all right, isn't it?" she asked, her voice cracking on a sob, the pain as much emotional as physical. "Hannibal—" Margot hugged her from behind, resting her head against Alana's, trying to soothe her.
"It's going to be fine,"
Hannibal said, moving toward her, but holding himself in check. He smiled, putting every bit of his confidence into his expression to calm her, before he said,
"Miss Shell is an excellent midwife. It is exceptionally good to see you here, Miss Shell."
"Wish I could say the same, Doctor, but you know my opinion about men in the birthing room." Miss Shell sniffled, disapproving.
"Yes, Miss Shell, your opinion on the subject has never been in doubt to anyone with functional hearing. But I am pleased to see you nonetheless, I assure you. You are in the best of hands, Miss Bloom."
Her smile was tremulous, dissolved into frightened, exhausted tears as she leaned into Margot, her fingers so tight on the wood that her nails blanched. Margot held her close, just as she had with Marissa, sharing Alana's pain as she always had and always would.
"Let's get you comfortable, shall we?"
Hannibal asked, and moved to peel her hand loose from where it clenched so tightly. It was a surprisingly difficult labor for a baby who had decided to come early and couldn't wait to emerge, difficult for Alana as well as Margot. For the most part, Hannibal had no role in the process, which he was rather used to in times like these, being there more as a precaution than anything. As he watched, however, the true agony of childbirth impressed itself upon him for the first time. He imagined Will in Alana's place, suffering the terrible pain of bringing a life into this world, with the chance that everything could go wrong, that the baby might not survive, that Will might not survive. It left him cold, and a selfish, hard part of himself half hoped that Will was right, and there would be no children, because he would gladly bear any pain in the world rather than see his cherished mate in such torment. "Dr. Head is presenting," Miss Shell announced, bringing an excited, exhausted laugh from the missus. From there it was fast. The baby emerged into the world to a chorus of relieved voices, sliding into Hannibal's clean, waiting hands in beautiful miniature, ruddy and small, and bearing a crown of thick, dark hair. Miss Shell moved with the precision of a soldier at drills, swiftly tying off the cord and cutting it to free the infant into their new environment.
"That's a good baby,"
Hannibal crooned, gently wiping it clean as he had a cursory check. The low, vibrating alpha purr in his voice brought a startled little hiccup from the infant, and it bellowed, red-faced and furious, much to Hannibal's delight. He grinned at Alana and said,
"He has your temper."
"It's a boy?" Alana asked, laughing in relief, tears streaming down her face as Margot kissed her cheek, delighted.
"I hope you will be on your toes, my dears,"
Hannibal said, eyes sparkling.
"You have yourselves an alpha. He's a healthy little man, aren't you, darling?"
"He's smaller than Marissa was," Margot said, a note of concern in her voice. She wiped at the tears on her face, not even that worry enough to steal her relief. "We've had smaller," Miss Shell said, her hard edge forgotten in the happiness of a successful birth. "Haven't we, Doctor?"
"Oh, yes, we have,"
Hannibal said, crooning to the child as he wrapped him up, cradling him in one arm.
"Yes, we most certainly have, haven't we? You're rather bigger than I was expecting, little one. Good thing, since you were so ready to come out."
He eased the baby down into Alana's trembling arms, tears filling his eyes as the misses wept, holding their son and clinging to one another. Hannibal stood apart from them, and watched euphoria replace the awful pain of the past endless hours, watched how pleasure lit up their faces as they welcomed their new baby into this world. Seeing them rejoice, he felt the final ties that bound them sever, the loose ends coiling to encapsulate their new addition. He reached for Will on pure instinct, seeking his own connection, needing his mate to share his happiness. His fingers found and caressed the blue garter ribbon threaded through his watch chain, all dark thoughts banished by the sight of celebration and the faint, sugary sweet flavor of Will's scent clinging to the ribbon. He reached for a bond he knew wasn't there for him, but that didn't stop him from trying. He took every happiness, trembling triumph, and incredible miracle of this moment, every hope he held that they might have their own children some day, and he thought of Will with all his might. Far away in Hartford House, Will Lecter Graham woke from his deep, easy slumber and smiled, happy tears welling down his cheeks in the starlit darkness of Hannibal's bed. Will armed himself in far more than clothing when he rose the next day, confident and relaxed from what the bond had provided him in the early morning hours. The pistol Hannibal had left him weighed at his pocket, a heavy reminder that he had more than just his wits to defend himself with, should the need arise. Without Hannibal there, the bulk of the work fell once more to Will, which included the disposition of Francis Dollaride, who, unfortunately, was nowhere to be found. "I beg your pardon, could you say that again? Mr. Dollaride has gone?" "Yes, your lordship," the detective said, frowning. "Gone where, exactly?" Will asked, putting his pen down to give the whole of his attention to the man before him. "We don't know, my lord," the other detective said, embarrassed. "We paid a lad to keep track of his whereabouts when we weren't able, and Dollaride vanished." "How long ago was this?" Will asked, drumming his fingers on the desk. "Couldn't be more than a day or two." "A day or two," Will echoed, his frown deepening. "And you've no idea where he's gone?" There was a somewhat shamefaced response to that, which failed to satisfy Will's unease. "Well, I suppose it's a good thing you're detectives," Will said, his smile tight and unhappy. "I want you to begin searching for him." "My lord, one of us—" "No, detective, both of you," Will said, holding up a hand to hush him. "I insist. Mr. Dollaride has a troubling history of violence. There is suspicion he may have been involved in the deaths of 2 officers from Mosley. You absolutely will not attempt to engage with him alone. Send to the capital if you must for help, but I want no one putting themselves at risk for this issue." "What do you want done when we find him, my lord?" "Tell him he is to contact Mr. Buddish in the capital for my instructions, or else he is to return to Hartford town and send word to me here," Will said, pushing to his feet. "In both cases, relate to him that I wish to fill my debt. He will do as he is bidden if he is half the man I believe him to be." "Right away, my lord." Mr. Hawkes came in as they went out, bearing a letter on the familiar silver salver.
"This came from courier via the train, my lord,"
Mr. Hawkes informed him, both mildly awed as well as scandalized by the mode of the letter's arrival. Will took it up with a murmured thanks, his heart leaping when he saw it was from Chelsea House, the paper still holding a trace of Hannibal's scent.
"Will, the baby was born without incident very early this morning, an alpha male the missus are calling Morgan. He is off to a good start, but he is somewhat frail. Alana is mending, Margot is beside herself with happiness, and the first thing Marissa did upon seeing her baby brother was say, "No," and begin to cry, so they are off to the usual sort of start. I am making arrangements for them with an associate of mine. However, Alana and Morgan both need time to recover, so I shall need to remain to watch over them for now until things are settled. I wish I were there with you now, Will, even if you are contemplating violence. No doubt you have had ample time to consider how this will read in the society column. I am making plans for that, however. I promised you I would put all else aside, and I always keep my promises. Trust me, Will. Believe in the best of me as I believe in the best of you, and be certain that my love for you will always guide my actions. Yours, always and forever, Hannibal.
Good news, I trust, my lord? Mr. Hawkes asked, relieved by the smile that curved Will's full lips. Very good, Mr. Hawkes, Will said, releasing a deep sigh to have his knowledge confirmed in writing. The emergency has been handled, and Lord Clarges is tending to the details now. Mr. Hawkes's silvering brows drew together in concern then, and he asked,
Please forgive me, my lord, but will his lordship be home in time for his grace's gathering?
Yes, Will said, confident that he would not be made a liar, putting his faith in Hannibal just as he'd been asked. He tucked the letter into his breast pocket, thinking he might soon run out of room to keep stashing things from his husband inside his jewelry box. He certainly will, Mr. Hawkes. Is grandfather awake?
He is, my lord,
Mr. Hawkes confirmed, and Will promptly set out for grandfather's suite.
Oh, my lord, the first of the applicants for the position has arrived at the office,
Mr. Hawkes said, gliding in Will's wake with portly grace.
Should I send someone to make excuses?
No, Mr. Hawkes, Will said, shaking his head, his determined stride eating up the distance to grandfather's rooms. He paused at the doorway, one hand pressing to his lower belly in an absent gesture that did not escape an old hand like Mr. Hawkes. Hartford House needs a qualified land agent, and I am the best one to make such a decision, all things considered. Have refreshments sent down to content them, and tell them I'll be there within the half an hour.
Yes, my lord,
Mr. Hawkes said, his face wreathed in a delighted smile Will found rather odd for such a simple request. He put it out of his mind, however, and knocked on grandfather's door, somewhat surprised when Mr. Zeller was the one who opened it for him. I hadn't realized you'd returned, Mr. Zeller, Will said, stepping into the suite to allow the scruffy-looking valet to close the door behind him.
Yeah, well, I try not to stay gone too long recently,
Zeller said with his usual amount of cheek.
Seems like every time I get back he's spiraled down a little further. Go on in, he's up, or as up as he's liable to get today.
Will moved through Roland's sitting room and into his bedroom, pausing for a moment in the doorway. Roland was still abed, looking exhausted and drawn. Staff busied about his room, drawing the curtains open and unlatching the windows to let in a breath of fresh air that he seemed desperately in need of. Good morning, grandfather, Will said, moving to fill the bedside chair, a place where he had passed many a long winter's night reading to Roland or listening to his stories.
Good morning, my dear,
Roland said, drawing a breath that pained him. His skeletal fingers stretched out, and Will moved to grasp them, wounded by how frail he seemed.
You look particularly beautiful today, Will. so much like him. Sometimes it hurts me, you know, how the pair of you resemble him.
Will smiled, chafing Roland's hand to warm his papery thin skin. Aunt Margaret didn't tell us as much as Hannibal would like you to think, Will said, pleased when Roland managed a wink, the man within unchanged by the years that had ravaged his body. But I feel we should discuss that when you are feeling better, grandfather. We will have plenty of evenings this winter to do so. He trailed off, wondering if they would have such. It felt vile and unkind to even consider it, but it felt just as unkind not to. I've come to tell you the baby has been delivered, he said, deciding not to use up what little energy Roland had. A little boy. He's an alpha and early, but he is thriving. Roland frowned and made a weak, sweeping gesture that instantly cleared the room of servants, leaving the pair of them alone. It took several concerning moments for him to manage.
I am not legitimizing the child.
Will was too startled for a moment to answer properly, but shook himself and said, No, grandfather, of course not. Hannibal hasn't told you. The baby isn't his. Roland's amber gaze sharpened, his mouth bowing in a confused frown. I'd rather he tell you the details, Will gently insisted, kissing Roland's bony knuckles. But he has no children, grandfather. Hannibal has never fathered a child outside of our marriage.
You...
Roland wheezed, wetting his lips, his fingers twitching in Will's grasp.
You believe him, my dear?
Your grandson is pompous, arrogant, and incredibly overbearing, but he is certainly no liar, Will said, his gentle grin teasing an answering smile from Roland. He confessed a great deal to me, grandfather, most of which is not mine to repeat. The heart of the matter is that his reputation is somewhat inflated, and he has vowed to maintain the sanctity of our marriage bed now that we share it. One bushy white eyebrow shot up over one amber eye, and there was a world of amusement in Roland's voice when he asked,
Sanctity?
Something like that, Will said, cheeks pinking up, but his smile unrepentant. I wanted to tell you before the papers made more of the situation than it deserves. Hannibal is working to mitigate the damage as we speak. There was a flash of disappointment in Roland's eyes, his dismay palpable when he asked,
He is not returning?
No, not yet. Things are fragile there still, and he has to be sure they are settled. But it is for the best, grandfather. I have some tenant disputes to settle and several applicants to interview, not to mention overseeing the guest suites and checking the linen situation. Mrs. Henderson found traces of moths. She was nearly inconsolable. Roland grinned, tired and vague, his lids growing heavier by the moment. I should let you rest, grandfather, Will said, disquieted by the understanding that Roland was not as invincible as he always seemed. The idea of Hartford House without his presence was as unwholesome and unhappy as imagining it without Hannibal there. Roland Lecter was Hartford House in Will's eyes, and it disturbed him to think that he might never hear the patter of those little feet Will had foolishly promised him so long ago.
Did Hannibal speak to you about Lord Rathmore?
Roland asked, his lids lifting a fraction, resisting the lure of sleep. Yes, he did. I would like to take a look at the papers when you're feeling more alert. My own curious nature compels me. It is nothing that needs to be done just now. Roland fumbled his free hand toward his nightstand, gesturing for Will to open it. He did so, releasing Roland's hand. There was a miniature there, an old portrait of a man who could have been himself, but long and spare, painted facing a youth who was clearly a young version of Roland himself.
Keys,
Grandfather wheezed, bringing him back to the task at hand. Will quickly fished them out, thumbing through them for a small one Roland nodded at. He knew without asking which drawer it unlocked, and found the papers neatly contained. Roland dozed off while he perused them, and never stirred as Will put everything back where he had found it. He returned the keys to the drawer, unable to resist looking at the miniature. The pull that Aunt Margaret had spoken of was evident in the painting, an almost elemental force between two people whose familial obligations had parted them. It was surreal to see someone so similar to himself looking up from the canvas with limpid blue eyes, as soft and serene as Aunt Margaret had sighed over. There had been no portraits in his childhood home of any relative close to him, which made the miniature all the more precious. The edges of the picture were worn smooth by the brush of fingertips, and he imagined Roland gazing at it, stroking the picture with fond fingertips as he recalled the height of their love for one another. Seeing it, Will wondered if he might ever have something like this of Hannibal and himself, or if Hannibal might enjoy something more appropriate than a garter ribbon to protect him. Several times over the passing years Roland had entreated Will to sit for a portrait to place in the gallery, but Will had always declined. He had never imagined he would be staying, that some proper woman's portrait would take the place of his own. He found himself warming to the idea, however. The anniversary of their marriage loomed on the horizon, far enough away that there was time to have it tended to. He tucked the idea to the back of his mind, the rest of his formidable brain digesting the fact that Mr. Bronner, his father's solicitor, was on the list of Mr. Verger's prison visitors. Berger returned from Mr. Buddish's office with news that Abigail Hobbs had requested emancipation, and the Lord Chancellor was holding an audience with her later that evening to finalize the proceedings.
"And the matter of the council?"
Hannibal inquired, rising from his chair.
"Mr. Buddish says he's doing his best, but it's a blind council,"
Berger said, vastly troubled by even the mention of it.
"None of the names are available to the public. He's already gathering information his own self. There's a whole passel of folks concerned by it. With good reason, Berger. But hopefully between us all we can put a stop to it before it gains too much momentum. Did you ask about Henry?"
Hannibal asked, shrugging his shoulders to settle his jacket as he drew it back on. He'd napped some after sending off the courier to Hartford, dreaming of Will and fishing and an ocean of carpets yet to be explored. It left him pleasantly fuzzy and content, a feeling he hoped Will could sense despite their distance.
"I did, my lord. She takes her stroll as always, right on schedule. I was stopped by the tailors. The bulk of it's finished and being packed to ship tonight. Nicola sends their regards, told me not to worry. They'd see it delivered to Hartford personally in the morning."
That brought a pleased smile to Hannibal's face, and he hoped Will would be just as outraged as he'd first imagined.
"I wish I were there to see his face." "I reckon you're safe where you're at, my lord. He got himself one glorious temper, though, don't he?" "Yes, Berger, he certainly does,"
Hannibal agreed, adding with a devilish grin,
"and I don't want to miss a single second of it."
Berger chuckled, shaking his head, and told him,
"I'm very glad you're finally happy, Lord Clarges. All these years, I was so worried you'd never find it. I hope nothing ever takes that from you, my lord." "I won't if I can help it,"
Hannibal said, but gave his valet and longtime friend a warm smile.
"And thank you, Berger. I hope some day you'll find the same happiness for yourself."
Berger's face went red to the tips of his ears, and he stammered,
"Oh, that ain't a proper wish for a servant, my lord. Heavens! Mr. Price would cackle like a hyena if he heard you say that. Now, you best get yourself to the park. I'll have a peek in at the missus."
Hannibal showed him some mercy and did as he was bidden, amused by Berger's response, but not surprised by it. For a man who mothered everyone in his reach, Berger grew profoundly beside himself when any care was extended his direction, and it never failed to tickle Hannibal pink. He took himself downstairs and quickly donned his coat, gloves, and hat with Mr. Black's somber assistance. Within moments he was outside in the weak mid-morning sun and on his way to Kelly Park. It was just beginning to stir with the fashionable out seeing and being seen. Hannibal hadn't often taken walks at the acceptable hour, his schedule being too full, but he was recognized and greeted by nearly everyone as he made his unhurried way around the lake. Henriette of Kirk was installed in a bevy of attentive ladies, and a few token guards spared by the royal family. She floated along the path in a spill of tinkling laughter that made Hannibal smile, because there was no one in the world more determined to be carefree than the Lady Witham. She spied him walking toward her, and quickened her pace, calling out, "Hannibal! How worried I've been!"
"Good morning, Henry,"
Hannibal said, tipping his hat to her, and the group at large as they all came to a pause together.
"Ladies, good morning to you. I found myself in need of some fresh air and diverting company after a very wearying evening, and the gods saw fit to oblige me with a spray of colourful young blossoms."
Even the oldest among them blushed, their wry smiles indulgent of him. A little flattery, Hannibal knew, rarely did harm, and Henry's acquaintances delighted in being delighted in. "You scoundrel! Don't you dare attempt to distract us. Bert told me you were very cross with him at the party. How I wish I'd gone, but Adele was ill, you see," Henry said, wasting no time in looping her arm through his and tugging him back the way he'd come. "You should visit the nursery for a check. I cannot tell you how it would relieve me."
"Henry, my dear,"
Hannibal said, covering her slender hand on his elbow with his own warm smile.
"I would love nothing more than to do so, but I've my hands full just now, and I trust the king's own physician is more than up to the task."
"Well, naturally, but he isn't you," she said, casting a meaningful glance over her shoulder that put a sizable gap between them and her eager attendants. "There now. I've met your spouse. Did he tell you?"
"He did,"
Hannibal said, tipping his face to the breeze, which blew in from the north and chased the worst of the capital's smog away.
"But tell me, how did you find him?"
"Beautiful," she said, a dimple flashing in her cheek as she smiled. "Younger than I expected, and nowhere near as solid as Bert was rhapsodizing about. He was quite enchanted, Hannibal. Mind you keep an eye on your mate. You know how Bertram loves a distraction."
"I'm afraid Will wouldn't be very agreeable to that, Henry. But I am very glad you don't think he's brawny."
"Oh, heavens, no! How terrible! He's perfectly marvelous," Henry praised, squeezing his arm with a delighted smile. "And how did he find me?"
"Fascinating and alluring were two observations he made to me,"
Hannibal said, angling a look down at her lovely face. It was hard to catch her delicate scent in the breeze, but what he did manage was rather pleasant, melding with her perfume as it was.
"I believe the one I should watch is you, my dear. I've only just convinced him to like me. Wouldn't do to lose him so quickly to your formidable charms."
She rolled her eyes heavenward, well used to his effusive compliments. "But where is he? Perhaps we might all lunch together."
"Will has gone on to Hartford in preparation for one of grandfather's little parties,"
Hannibal said, relaxing in the presence of an old friend.
I had gone on 2 only when I was called back for an emergency."
"Oh?" Henry asked, brows shooting to her hairline as she took a nonchalant glance around them. "Would this have anything to do with the mysterious arrival of a pregnant person to Chelsea House yesterday?"
"Yes, it would. A poor woman."
Hannibal sighed, exchanging polite greetings with a passing group of young men.
"We knew one another through medical school I am backing. She and her wife were walking the grounds with the board and surveyors yesterday evening, and she went into early labor."
"Goodness, how ghastly!" Henry said, paling, her brown eyes widening.
"Indeed it was. I brought her to Chelsea House, naturally, as I am known to them all, and it was so near at hand. My staff is instructed to always admit emergency cases. They contacted me as quickly as possible and sent for the midwife."
Henry pressed her slender, ring-laden hand to her chest, genuinely distressed. "But is she well? How does the child fare?"
"They are both quite well and thriving, only they will have to spend a rather long time here at Chelsea House,"
Hannibal confided with a thoughtful frown.
"It disturbs me to think how people will gossip. Will would be so hurt by such fallacies, and yet it is my duty to help those who need me. I can hardly turn out a family with an early infant when they simply cannot travel."
"Darling, say no more," Henry insisted, hugging his arm to her bosom. "I will counter anyone who claims there is anything the least bit improper about this situation. You have my word on that."
"Thank you, Henry,"
Hannibal said, adding with a grin,
"I can always rely on you when it comes to parlor gossip."
She gave him a light slap on his wrist, and her lovely nose wrinkled in a frown of annoyance. "How you and Bertram do go on! I will have you know, Lord Clarges, that I am perfectly capable of keeping a secret that deserves to be kept."
"I know you've successfully kept one from me, haven't you?"
Hannibal inquired, his grin fiendish with delight when she glowered at him.
"As Will pointed out to me."
"I have done nothing of the sort," she said, a sniff of disdain accompanying another wrinkle of her nose. "It is no fault of mine that your sense of smell is so appallingly limited when it comes to those around you. Not to mention your terrible attitude, which did little to encourage my confidence. I imagine had you never reconciled with your lovely little mate, you would have gone to the grave not realizing you kept a secret from yourself where I am concerned."
"Forgive me,"
Hannibal said, and after a moment he tugged on her arm, coaxing.
"Henry, forgive me."
"You deserve nothing of the sort, you terrible tease," she said, but relented when he grinned and sighed. "Shame on you, Hannibal. Truly, shame on you."
"Believe me, I am thoroughly shamed every time I look at my brilliant mate and realize what I've deprived myself of all these years,"
Hannibal said, his grin fading to a fond smile.
"I do adore him, Henry."
"You better. Else Bert and I will be wooing him, and you know how happy my husband and I are to make new friends."
"I'm afraid Will has his hands too full at the moment to offer either one to your cause,"
Hannibal said, watching her smile to herself, impish and endearing. "I spoke to Bertram regarding your Miss Hobbs," she said, drawing a deep breath of the cool, refreshing air. "He was tasked to assist in the case. Wouldn't tell me a thing, of course, wretched man. But the papers seem to think Mr. Hobbs is heading north."
"North?"
Hannibal asked, stomach sinking with apprehension. "Yes. Someone at the train station reported him boarding the northbound, but someone else reported seeing him heading into the east side, so there's really no telling. People have been seeing him in every shadow and behind every door since the papers first wrote of the case."
"How long ago did the train sighting occur?"
Hannibal asked, unwilling to discount even a rumor of Hobbs heading north. "A day ago? 2 days? I cannot remember just now." Henry sighed, her brow wrinkling up in thought. "I imagine he's trying to reach the border, don't you? Bert believes so. I'm sure he sent word to every crossing. I shouldn't like to think what will happen to Hobbs when he's found, but I cannot help feeling it's exactly what he deserves." Hannibal's heart tightened in his chest, uncomfortable and stifled, because surely Hobbs wouldn't think to go to Hartford, where Abigail was born, where Miriam Lass still lived, where Will currently was. He listened with polite affection while Henry chattered, but his concern grew teeth that bit deep into his heart as he thought about Garrett Jacob Hobbs and what he might be planning. The moment he returned to Chelsea House, Hannibal hastily wrote a note warning Will and Grandfather that Hobbs could be heading north, and to take extra precautions. With Miss Shell making arrangements for a nurse to remain with the missus, and with Dr. Sutcliffe clearing his schedule to look in on them for the remainder of their stay, he was hopeful he would be home within the next day, and able to take personal charge of Will's security. As reluctant as he was to leave the Misses and their little family so soon, he was no longer a part of what they shared, and he was anxious to return to Will's side. He couldn't imagine being separated from his mate in any long-term way, not when he missed him so deeply after even so short a time.
"Have this dispatched by courier at once,"
Hannibal said, handing it off to Berger with a nervous flick of his eyes.
"And hire at least 5 men from the agency to accompany it. I want them watching the grounds and my mate around the clock."
"Yes, my lord," Berger said.
"Lord Clarges, there is a caller for you, my lord,"
Mr. Black said, smoothly sidestepping Berger, who rushed out to get the courier and guards onto the earliest train. Hannibal picked up the card, distracted, and was no wiser when he read the name, except that his visitor was a Mr. Clark Ingram from the Ministry of War.
"Put him in the study, Black,"
Hannibal said, frowning. He thought of the soldiers moving south and the fall of Ostum and the war that simply would not end, and he grew cold to consider what the Ministry of War might ask of him. It was a dreadful train of thought, and Hannibal was still somewhat distracted by his worries when Mr. Black admitted him to the study, where the rather unsettling Mr. Ingram waited for him.
"Lord Clarges,"
he said, rising and offering his hand, which Hannibal only glanced at but did not take. Mr. Ingram dropped his hand, but his smile stayed the same, wide, and stretched almost like a grimace.
"I appreciate you seeing me on such short notice." "You have the advantage of surprise, Mr. Ingram,"
Hannibal said, gesturing that he should sit. He took his own seat behind the desk and waited, uncertain of what the odd beta man could possibly want of him.
"I am a curious creature."
"I will get straight to the point," Mr. Ingram said, settling into the chair with both hands neatly folded into his lap.
"I come representing the Council for the betterment of Omegas."
Hannibal's brows rose.
"Your card informed me you were here on behalf of the War Office."
"I am an employee of the Ministry of War, Lord Clarges, yes," Ingram said, ever pleasant. It made Hannibal uneasy the way he persisted in maintaining that stiff smile and false good cheer. It was downright unnatural. "And the Council is working in conjunction with the Ministry to support and assist Omegas."
"How odd,"
Hannibal breathed, fingers idly tracing the edge of the desk.
"As Omegas are not allowed into the military."
Ingram's smile cracked just a little with the hairline of menace. "Rules are often broken, Lord Clarges. The Council exists to ensure that Omegas are protected."
"Protected in what sense?"
"There have been reports, of course, that Omegas have enlisted," Ingram said, his posture so stiff he might as well have been a ventriloquist doll. "The Council is seeking to locate them and remove them from dangers they simply should not be facing."
"Remove them? To prison, perhaps?"
Ingram's smile cracked just a bit more. A flash of something unpleasant bloomed in his black eyes, but was quickly stifled by good sense. "They are breaking the laws, which we all must abide by, Lord Clarges. It is our aim to prevent more Omegas from making the same mistakes and finding themselves in places which are hostile."
"So you seek to make examples of those who have already done so, despite the fact that they have fought bravely to keep the country safe, while you remain here plotting against them."
There was a long, pregnant silence before Ingram said, "I was given your name by an officer who served with you, Lord Clarges. He informed me that you would be more than happy to sponsor the Council's candidate in the elections next term. He gave me the impressions that you would be supportive of our efforts to see that there are more solid, specific laws in place for Omegas."
"For their betterment."
Ingram's smile was wide and tight and toothy. "Yes, for their betterment. They need the protection of their superiors. It isn't their fault that nature has denied them the sense to make informed decisions. They are precious and should be protected as such. The Council will see that they have firm rules in place to guide them and prevent them from engaging in risk-taking behaviors they cannot fully comprehend the impact of." A cold, trembling anger snaked its way through Hannibal's veins. As evenly as he could manage, he asked,
"You are aware that my spouse is Omegan?"
"Of course, Lord Clarges," Ingram said, beaming, "which will make your endorsement all that much more legitimate in the eyes of the voting populace, your dealings with your mate notwithstanding."
"It might interest you to know that I have no interest in putting Omegas under laws that are even more oppressive than they are at present," he said, growing increasingly incensed. Whatever impression my old military colleague has given you, I have no desire to see Omegas shackled to their alphas' beds like chattel, and this talk of punishing soldiers who have bravely served the crown is frankly indecent. Should such Omegas exist, they have every right to the same decorations and respect their full male counterparts are given.
Ingram just smiled at him. Damn the man. Smiled that waxy smile of his and said, "Oh, believe me, Lord Clarges, they exist. The council is rooting them out as we speak. It is up to you, of course, whether you wish to be part of our work and protect Omegas as they deserve to be protected. I would never presume to tell you your business, but I can say that your past actions and what the council knows of your personal beliefs are very much aligned with those of our members, and we should be delighted to have you number as one of us."
Let it be the ember which will consume that awful council in flames.
Hannibal settled back in his chair, frowning. "We are having a meeting," Mr. Ingram said, his fixed smile as empty of life as a doll's. "Perhaps you might attend."
Will all of the members be there?
"Most, save for Lord Reddick, who rarely leaves the countryside," Mr. Ingram said, giving Hannibal a dull start of surprise to hear Will's father mentioned. "It will not be a public meeting, of course. Our members value their privacy, and it would be inconvenient were their involvement to be made common knowledge before election term."
"Naturally,"
Hannibal said, quietly enraged. Even at his worst he had been better than this council, because at least he had never tried to hide his own prejudice, boorish as he had been.
"What time is this meeting?"
10 o'clock, Mr. Ingram said, thoroughly pleased. "It is an informal meeting, of course, something of a familiarization for new members."
"Leave the details with Mr. Black,"
Hannibal instructed, refusing once more to shake the man's hand.
"I will see if my schedule allows for it."
If it accomplished nothing else, at least it would supply Mr. Buddish with the names of those who sought to hide their involvement in such sordid dealings, and Hannibal would have a better idea of just what they were up against when he moved to consume that ugly council in flames. There wasn't much time to dwell on the strange discovery he'd made in Grandfather's papers. Between conducting interviews, tidying up work left undone in his absence, and tending to some correspondence, Will found better than half the day had passed with only tea and a few small sandwiches to sustain him. Seeing Mr. Bronner's name on Zeller's list had served to remind him of another letter that had gone missing, however, and he wrote once more to him to recant the contents, explaining that his circumstances had changed and he had no need of such extreme measures. He gathered up his packets as well as the bundle of correspondences that had been delivered in the afternoon, and left the little office, locking the door behind him. The footman who had accompanied him down was nowhere in sight, nor was Winston. Will whistled, wondering if the dog had been taken for a walk, but when Winston came crashing out of the wood line alone, barking with high spirits, Will assumed there had been a miscommunication on his part. It wasn't far to the house, however, and he considered himself safe enough on the path, armed as he was. He hurried on his way, relieved when he spied Peter out in front of the stables. He raised his hand in greeting, calling out, "Peter, how's Athena? How many puppies did she have?" He was somewhat taken aback when Peter began to wave both arms over his head in a panic, too frightened to shout back to him. A split second later, the wind shifted, bringing Will the oily scent of rancid lard. He turned, heart pounding, and found himself face to face once more with Garrett Jacob Hobbs.